everyone. Welcome to this week's Middle East and Africa Forum for Sustainability Leaders podcast, of course, created in strategic partnership with Microsoft. Essentially, a community built by sustainability leaders for sustainability leaders, where it is a knowledge reservoir for stakeholders to tap into to help essentially navigate their roadmap ahead. Today, we are tackling the critical question of what's the most effective route to accelerate the energy transition in Middle East and Africa. And I'm joined here today with our special guests, Dr. Patrick Allman-Ward, who is the CEO of Dana Gas, and Robin Mills, who is the CEO of Kamar Energy. Thank you both for joining the show. Patrick, I'd first like to kick off with you for your opening comments. Of course, we're coming into the end of the year. I feel like the past few months have been somewhat of a sprint. COP27, ADIPEC, we have COP28 already, moving full steam ahead for next year. I just wanted to get your opening comments on the overall topic.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks for the invitation to join this podcast. I mean, let me step back perhaps a little bit and make some more generic comments about the energy transition, and then maybe we can zoom in a little bit to the specifics of the Middle East. So the first comment I'd like to make is that the current energy crisis is frankly a politically made crisis, and it results directly from underinvestment, forced underinvestment in the energy system, and in particular in the European context, the underinvestment in gas. And the second point I'd like to make, of course, is that the energy transition is exactly that. It's a transition. It's not a step function. And I think that a lot of advocates out there seem to think that it is a step function, and that very bad policy decisions are being taken in the mistaken belief that this is something that you can switch off one system that's taken 300 years to build and replace it with another one very quickly in a space of tens, if not 30 years or so. So this is a very, very significant challenge, both in terms of making that transition and in terms of policy making. I suppose the third real major point I'd like to make, and it's an obvious one, but I think, again, politicians tend to forget it, is that consumers want energy 24/7, 365. They don't want intermittent energy. They want energy all the time. And so, the transition to renewables, which we need to do, and we need to go much faster than we're currently going. We need as much of it as we can, as quickly as possible. But it does need, a baseload backup energy, and that, in my view, is best done by gas. If you transfer coal power generation to gas power generation, it would result in a 15% reduction in global CO2 emissions. It's obviously, nothing is a silver bullet, but it's a really significant contribution. If you combine renewables with coal, which is essentially the policy decision that the Germans have made, you reduce CO2 emissions roughly by 35%, because that's the average uptime of renewable energy. If you combine it with renewables with gas, you can get a 70% CO2 reduction, twice as much. So, I mean, that's a very, very significant contribution. I think that clearly is a direction that all countries should be going in, but it certainly also applies here in the Middle East. So to kind of illustrate that making the good the enemy of the perfect is that in our operations in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, we're producing 450 million standard cubic feet per day of gas for power generation, and that displaces dirty diesel and fuel oil. And that, since 2007, has resulted in total emissions reductions of 40 million tons of CO2. So that's more than the global contribution of electric vehicles to date. So again, it puts into perspective, the significant contribution that gas to power displacing dirtier fuels has to play. And again, that is something that's very much MENA driven. A lot of people think that gas is a transition fuel. I'm a bit more optimistic. I think it has a much longer role to play, but clearly it has to be decarbonized at some point in time, and therefore there has to be a combination of gas with CCUS. And again, I think the MENA region is a great example, and the UAE in particular, of the direction in which they are going with respect to this combination of elements. I think what people also
we'll,
forget.
We'll touch on CCUS. I think that was an amazing point. Yeah.
I think what people forget, and particularly the policy makers in Europe, Brian, and this will be my last point, is that gas and oil, they decline at between 5 and 10% per annum. So in order to keep even flat, let alone grow, you need to keep investing. And so the policy of disinvestment out of oil and gas production is a recipe for continued future high energy prices. And that's not what we want, and it's not the direction we want to go in. So back to you, sorry, Brian.
Thanks, Robin. I'd just like to bring you in too, just touching on that point is obviously the energy transition is not, just flipping on a switch. We recently had His Excellency Sultan Al Jaber say, of course, over ADIPEC, maximum energy with emissions is the goal. I just want you to get your opening comments on that thought and, of course, where your outlook is as we move into the new year.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. Well, this talk we're having now is focused on sustainability. And I think the first point is, sustainability it's about emissions. It's about the climate. It's about the environment. Absolutely. But those are not the only components of sustainability. We also have to look at social sustainability, having economic and energy arrangements that people find acceptable and that deliver a good standard of living and that work for all kind of major interest groups. And of course, we have economic sustainability in the sense of people getting the energy that they need to be able to run a working economy. And you see it in very different ways today. You see that in Europe, where European industry is really struggling with very high energy bills, and that of course casts the future of European industry into doubt and all the employment that goes with that. And then you see this in parts of Africa and South Asia, where people don't have access to modern energy and electricity is not available or is very unreliable. And also, of course, there's no hope of building a modern economy or having access to things like safe drinking water and medical care and so on without reliable electricity. So, these are all essential components of sustainability, and we can't have a low carbon economy that's acceptable and workable if it's unaffordable or if it doesn't deliver reliable energy. So that's really the first thing. I think the second thing is energy policy so far in terms of decarbonisation has focused far too much on the supply side and on trying to reduce oil and gas and coal production and output, and far too little on the demand side in terms of making sure that people have viable alternatives, and in terms of doing very simple basic things like, for example, Patrick mentions coal to gas switching, but on the demand side we have areas like insulation, home efficiency, ensuring home heating in non-emitting ways but reliable home heating. That's again been a major failing of European policy. In particular, I don't only want to single out Europe. Europe is an example right now. Over the past decade and more, the failure to think hard enough about the demand side while concentrating very much on the supply side. I was thinking about this only today. I saw HSBC has announced that they won't finance new oil and gas production. Okay, I mean that's understandable. But my question then would be, well, would you finance an aeroplane? Would you finance an airline to buy a new aeroplane? Would you finance a shipping line to buy a ship? Those things will last for 30 years. They will burn fossil fuels for 30 years. Why would you finance a plane or a ship, but you would not finance a shale oil well in the US, which will only produce its useful life for 5 years or so? This is about energy transition. It's absolutely not about going cold turkey on fossil fuels, which is not feasible. And I think the third part of this is, that when we turn to the Middle East, we speak about the energy transition. This is a move to a new energy system, but it's an energy system that will have many features of the old system, but in a more intelligent and cleaner way, and repurposing existing assets. Patrick, of course, mentions carbon capture, use and storage. Absolutely essential. We can continue using oil and gas and even coal, but capture the emissions and dramatically reduce our environmental footprint. We can use oil and gas in non-emitting ways, for example, for petrochemicals and chemicals and plastics and so on will remain a very important part of the economy. We have new emerging uses for plastics and for non-metallic materials, which will use oil in that way. And then just cleaning up the oil industry in general, energy efficiency, electrification, reducing methane leaks. There's a whole set of techniques to ensure that the upstream emissions are as low as possible. So that's really what we talk about when we talk about a sustainable economy and an energy transition.
Just touching on that as well, it seems that there are a lot of pieces, of course, that have been identified, but now it's implementation, right? Are you seeing, we have these visions, we have, of course, these large scale actions that are kind of being put out there, but are you seeing actual blueprints that are being developed, roadmaps that are moving forward, and practical steps being taken in this space for the energy transition here in the region?
Well, I think you're very right, Brian, to distinguish, aspirations from practical blueprints, and then to distinguish practical blueprints from real actions on the ground. So, several countries in the region have net zero commitments: UAE by 2050, Oman by 2050, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia by 2060. So yes, so there is the aspiration, and behind that are goals to cut emissions by certain amounts by 2030 and so on. And then in terms of blueprints, of course, that then goes into, okay, so what is your blueprint for CCUS in your economy? What is your blueprint for hydrogen? What is your blueprint for renewables? And all the other components. And yes, many parts of that exist, but not all, and not all is fleshed out enough. And there's still, I'd say, some obviously depends which country you look at, but there's still some major parts where the question's still out there, and I'd say particularly on things like transport, like electric vehicles, like energy efficiency. Some of the countries in the region have articulated plans for those, some have not. And then there's the question, what's really going on the ground? And I think, again, the picture's patchy, but some parts of it are very impressive. If you look at the UAE's nuclear and solar power program, you look at the emerging Saudi solar power program, you look at Egypt's solar power and wind power as well, some enormous renewable energy projects, including amongst the biggest in the world in terms of both solar and wind. The hydrogen economy, very rapidly advancing in this region. We have huge hydrogen projects being launched in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman. So those are all major sources of low carbon energy, which is a feedstock for industry as well. I think we'll see more move on low carbon energy. Carbon capture and storage, we've got big plans, big targets in Qatar, in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, amounting to tens of millions of tons of CO2 captured. So yeah, these are all highly material things. Now, we need to see more of this. We need to see these projects go faster. We need to see some of the other countries in the region that have not moved so fast picking up on this as well. But at least it's promising, and this region at least has demonstrated that it can deliver these mega projects on scale and in a rapid time period.
Patrick, I just want to touch on that point, of course, of carbon capture, and in terms of technologies that we have an outlook, going into the new year, of kind of what needs to really be implemented and turning the dial to achieve our goals. Carbon capture, again, there's ambitions and plans, but in terms of implementation and scalability and scaling up that technology, it seems that it's still kind of progressing at a certain pace. What do you see as the challenges behind the implementation of that, and what is your outlook in terms of rapidly expanding that space?
So, Brian, I'm a geologist, so it is entirely logical that you extract hydrocarbons out of the ground, you burn them, you take the CO2 content as a result of that combustion process, and you stick the CO2 back in the ground. Oil fields and gas fields, in many cases, have been around and have proven their capacity to retain petroleum products and gas for tens to hundreds of millions of years. I think there is a narrative out there that's being propagated, perhaps by the anti-fossil fuel industry, because if you can abate CO2, and that's of course the whole point of the energy transition. It's not to stop fossil fuels; it's to decarbonize our energy system. And if you can decarbonize the petroleum energy system, particularly the gas system, by capturing the carbon and sequestrating it, then that allows the industry to continue. And there are groups of activists out there who just want to shut down the petroleum industry in its entirety, which is frankly the wrong objective. So as a geologist, the subsurface aspects and risks are extremely low. So what are and I can go into more details if you want. I mean, there are more risks associated with preventing leakage through the existing well infrastructure. So we do have to make absolutely sure that the the wells that have been drilled into these fields in order to enable production are fully and completely sealed. That is not a problem. We do that all the time in the industry. So what is the problem? The problem is frankly twofold. The first is the cost of extracting the carbon out of the flue gases. We have seen the impact of costs on solar and wind over the course of the last 15, 20 years, and particularly over the course of the last 10 years in terms of huge reductions in costs associated with government's willingness to support R&D. And I think this is an area where we have not made any progress really significantly for the last 10 to 15 years in terms of extraction, more cost-effective mechanisms to extract carbon out of flue gases. My estimate at the moment is it's still costing $30 to $40 per metric ton of CO2 to do that, and that's just far too high. In terms of transport, there is a cost associated obviously with transportation of CO2 from the point source to the disposal point. Again, if it's by pipeline, that's relatively cheap to do. If it's by specially designed vessels, that's clearly more expensive. And then thirdly and finally, of course, is the legislative environment. Is there an effective carbon trading system in place, or even a carbon tax? And is that conducive towards offsetting the costs of CCUS? At the moment, depending on where you are, Europe CCUS costs anything between $80 and $100 per ton. We've done a study in Egypt, and we think we can do it for about half of that, because we can make use of our existing depleted gas fields in the Nile Delta, and we can pipe the CO2 from emitting sources close by. So, it does vary very much indeed. But of course, currently in Egypt, there is no legislation with respect to carbon pricing. But with the CBAM, the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism coming into place, anybody hoping to export products into Europe will have to take into account the carbon cost of doing so, because either they have to do it themselves before they export, or they're going to have to pay the tax on importing their products. So I think this is going to be a great push to enabling CCUS, and particularly in those environments where there are intrinsically lower costs than elsewhere.
Do you think we recently had again that aspect of putting value on carbon? We recently had a discussion in Oman where they were looking at the viability of implementing carbon capture as a tool, of course, to hit their net zero target that was just announced earlier the month. And I think the overall consensus was most likely not. Do you see in this region that there will be tangible steps in terms of developing that market where more value is put on the carbon aspect, and essentially incentivizing people to look at that opportunity?
I think the driver is going to be the consuming markets. So in Europe, there is already a CBAM mechanism that has been contemplated and will be put in place. Japan has demonstrated its willingness to pay a green premium on low carbon or even carbon neutral products of either LNG or ammonia or other products. So I think the driver is going to be increasingly in the hands of the importing countries, either by paying a green premium on the products that they are prepared to consume, or because there is a tax mechanism that incentivizes producers to take the carbon out of their products. So one way or the other, both mechanisms work, but obviously it's easier and quicker to drive it if you impose a tax at source, rather than a more complicated mechanism of incentivizing producers to decarbonize as a result of taxes that you will otherwise impose on importation of those products.
Robin, I just want to step towards the finance aspect of things. We just had that conversation at ADIPEC where a large international bank said that capital actually wasn't the issue. There are other underlying aspects in terms of deploying it. What is your thoughts on financing the energy transition? Is there progress being made, or essentially is there still issues in assessing the risks for investments?
Well, that's a pretty big and complex topic, Brian. But look, I'd say, look, big picture, yes, I think there isn't a shortage of finance. And this is usually the case for finance. There isn't a shortage of finance for good projects. So the issue is creating good projects. And then the question is, okay, if you want to do something like a carbon capture project, for example, what's your business case? Do you have a viable business case? We see now that there is a viable business case in the US because there are very generous tax credits. There is a viable business case in Europe because the carbon price has risen to levels to make carbon capture projects viable. There is not, in general, a viable business case in the Middle East at the moment. Now, that may come through people who are exporting to Europe, as Patrick mentions, and who are exposed to carbon tariffs. Not everybody in the Middle East will be in that position. Then you have, of course, government companies and state oil companies, which essentially will just say, we think we need to do a carbon capture project to hit our targets, and then it's up to the government to put a line item in the budget to support that. But if you think about other industries, or power generations on which are serving the domestic market, do they have a case for carbon capture today? Well, no, not really. And that would apply, Patrick mentions bringing down the cost of CCS. That needs to happen. But that would apply, whether it's $100 a ton or $30 a ton, if there isn't a price for it, then very few people will do it. So it's really a question of, on the financing side, I think, just making sure that the government incentives or the market incentives are there so that people have viable business cases to attract financing. And I point to CCS because that's one technology in particular that has always struggled to attract finance. The economics of it, and the technology of it is straightforward enough. It's just a question of getting someone to pay for it. We've seen that where people are willing to pay for effectively much higher carbon prices for electric vehicles or renewable energy, which is kind of hidden in those projects, but they've been very successful. And so, look at renewable energy in the Middle East, has no trouble attracting finance. It gets people finance projects at 80 or 85% of the capital commitment, and achieve extremely attractive rates. And banks have accepted that these are very low risk and highly financeable projects. We're starting to see in hydrogen now, where you have a good credible off-taker for a hydrogen project. Banks can get comfortable with that technology as well, can finance that as well. So, it's really a question of business models, I think, rather than the financing side. That's obviously talking about kind of big, centralized low carbon projects. I think a couple of gaps I would point to, one is on, and again, I come back to demand. One is on the demand side. So what about financing, for example, energy efficiency? If you're talking about fixing up buildings, maybe individual homes to improve energy efficiency. In Europe, you have a whole set of incentives for that. Even those don't necessarily always work very well. You don't really have that in the Middle East. If you want to improve the efficiency of your air conditioning, things like that, or improve your insulation, there's not really financing available for those kind of small scale projects. And then, the big question I think that we saw at COP27 in Egypt was the whole question of financing for adaptation. So, many lower income countries are suffering from climate change. They need money to develop greater resilience, to improve agriculture, have new crop varieties, to improve sea defenses, all these kind of things. And those projects the benefits are pretty diffuse, hard to identify business case that, they need financial support. Wealthy countries have promised some, not enough, and a lot of it doesn't turn up. So that's a whole other side of the sustainability area where indeed financing is a problem.
Patrick, I just want to go into the culture aspect. Obviously, with these kind of low carbon targets, sustainability targets, it's going to require one, innovation, but two, also attracting, let's say, a younger generation of leaders, essentially. How can the industry create or enhance an innovative culture within the sector that essentially will help accelerate its journey on the sustainability pathway?
So a couple of points, Brian, around that. The first, I think, is that there's no question that in this decarbonization journey that we have to make, that there is a huge onus on the industry to decarbonize their own systems. And that means methane abatement, and it means no routine flaring, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm very proud of the fact that in our operations we have less than 8 kilograms per barrel of oil equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions. which corresponds to, well, or rather contrast with the industry average of over 20. So, getting your own act together, reducing your own carbon footprint is absolutely essential, and we are making strides to do that, to further reduce our carbon footprint. The second thing I think, which is important, and this doesn't apply uniquely to the petroleum industry, is that as we touched upon a little bit earlier, it's not good enough to have aspirational statements. What we absolutely need to show are scientific, measurable emissions baselines and clear plans and targets and projects that we are going to put in place over a defined time frame to further reduce the carbon footprint, with an objective to reach a certain point, a certain level at a certain point in time. Now that kind of approach is universally applicable and needs to be done by everybody who is consuming energy and therefore emitting greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just the petroleum industry. It is something that is universally applicable, and it's something I think that needs to happen more in this part of the world, where I think, although we're probably ahead of the curve with respect to renewables, with respect to commitments, with respect to actions being taken on the ground with CCUS and hydrogen, that a more general application of objectives by companies to achieve their low carbon goals, whether that be net zero or some other objective, is absolutely essential. And I think we need to be held accountable by our shareholders and by the regulators to do that.
I think what you just mentioned there, we're talking about innovative culture, a lot of course, next steps on what needs to be done, essentially. But in essence, if you look at the oil and gas industry, we're looking at COP28 now is going to be at the table, really at the heart of creating solutions. And I do think that the industry has been able to innovate, if you look at the course of history. Do you think that the industry itself, though, is struggling to promote that those innovations, that already somewhat kind of foundation of an innovative culture externally, to be part of this wider narrative?
Brian, we are our own worst enemy. I mean, we are the world's worst communicators. It is extraordinary that an industry which has resulted in the highest levels of global economic wealth, specifically since the Second World War, is vilified by the majority of the world's population who benefit most from what we do and what we have done. It is an extraordinary state of affairs, and it really is testament to the industry's inability to communicate its, the contributions that it has made, and the innovations. I mean, the challenges. Avion water costs over $200 a barrel. And what kind of innovations, technologies do they actually have to put in place to sell that product? Imagine the technical complexities of putting a platform in the North Sea for the size of the Troll gas field to exploit that, or the subsea completions in deep water that are in place. The huge technological complexities, the achievements in subsea imaging and subsurface imaging, the achievements on an engineering scale. These are extraordinary achievements that the industry has made. The industry has always been at the cutting edge of technology. We just totally failed to communicate that. It is still one of the most exciting places to work if you're on toll, in any of the sciences, engineering or geology, geophysics, whatever. It is a fantastically challenging and exciting place to work. We totally fail to communicate that. We are seeing unprecedented numbers or drops in numbers of students interested even in studying petroleum engineering or petroleum studies of any way, shape or form in the US and elsewhere. And that is a huge failing of the industry. I really do believe that this industry, not obviously uniquely, but has been a critical factor in the increasing standards of living of people over the course, particularly of the last 60, 70 years. And the challenge that we face is, of course, that the new populations in the emerging markets in the developing world have quite rightly the same aspirations to an improved quality of life that the Western world, the Northern Hemisphere, if you like, has become used to. And that, of course, just adds to our challenges with respect to CO2 abatement. But it also speaks, as touched upon by Robin, it speaks to an equitable transition. This is not about protecting the quality of life of the developed world at the expense of the developing world.
Robin, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that as well. There is a massive kind of warning sign out there in terms of an impending talent shortage for the oil and gas industry. Obviously, the oil and gas industry is going to be hard in that conversation. Communication has been the issue. What do you think can be done better in order to overcome that hurdle? Of course, being a part of this wider conversation now.
Well, look, Brian, the oil and gas industry, it's a fascinating place to work. It offers great careers. There is great travel opportunities. There is great opportunity to work on major projects, which are life-changing and transformational projects for the people that they serve. And there's a lot of high tech and extremely interesting and innovative stuff being done. So, I think part of the challenge is to tell that story about that this is an extremely rewarding career. Yes, financially, but in terms of the quality of the work in many ways. And it's becoming a different industry to work in. Firstly, many oil and gas companies are transforming, and that they're bringing in carbon capture, they're bringing in renewable energy, they're bringing in all kind of other businesses. So just joining a Shell or a BP today doesn't mean that your career necessarily will be a rig hand out in the middle of the North Sea. You're probably working on data, you're probably working on software and on new technologies, and it may be offshore wind, it may be retailing electricity to electric vehicle drivers. Could be all kind of careers. So I think part of it is about telling that story. I think we've also got to say, to be honest, the oil and gas industry in many ways has been a very good employer over the decades. In many ways, it's been a bad employer. It's a cyclical industry, and it's always gone through these cycles of job losses and casting people aside, and then finding a year or two later that there's a desperate squeeze and it's short of people. That's been the story of the oil industry for most of its history. I'm not sure that we necessarily going to change that here, but that part is not helpful, I think. On the other hand, it's not the only industry that has, unfortunately, casts people aside a bit too readily. And I think about telling that story, that this is not a sunset industry. This is an industry with decades of life ahead of it, and a transforming industry, and one that is going into new energies and is going into new ways of using oil and gas as well. And that from where we are here, absolutely has a 30-year career ahead of it for anybody entering the industry today, and that there is a very rewarding and a fascinating future for anybody coming in.
Where does inevitably, where does transparency fall into that equation? Of course, there's communication, but also transparency, along these journeys. Are you saying the industry embrace transparency now, essentially as a selling point, or is there still kind of a risk posture towards that?
Well, the industry is very risk averse, and as Patrick says, it doesn't communicate well, and it's very nervous about communicating. I think, for a variety of reasons, the industry doesn't like to trumpet that it's making very large profits, because it knows that will just attract the attention of politicians. In fact, its returns on capital are nothing special if you look at the software or the pharma industries. But the size of the profits are big because it's a big industry, and that obviously gets headlines. So the industry, downplays that to an extent. And I think they're obviously worried about legal liability and about attracting the attention of environmental groups and so on. So they don't trumpet their successes enough. But I do think that there's obviously a lot more that can be done about telling the positive story. It's important to be kind of honest and credible like that. I mean, anything an oil company does will attract attention of the charge of greenwashing. I've seen a carbon capture project recently of over $1 billion launched by a major oil company. It was described as greenwashing. Like, you don't spend $1 billion on greenwashing. This is clearly a real project that the company thinks is a major part of its future. But anything
I think the definition of greenwashing is kind of getting harder to understand nowadays, essentially.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I think you saw this at COP27. You know, I saw an NGO putting out a list of what they called fossil fuel lobbyists. And basically, this included virtually anybody. You know, if you were head of solar power at an oil company, you're a fossil fuel lobbyist. You know, so it becomes a bit ridiculous. So the oil company, I think, the energy companies and the oil and gas companies have got to pick their genuine stories that they can tell, and where they have a good story. But I think when it comes to things like CO2 emissions, and you know, Patrick mentioned that. There are some good stories to tell there about how emissions have been reduced. Problem is, everybody has their own definition. What does net zero mean? You know, what does carbon neutrality mean? When you reduce carbon intensity, are you actually reducing your overall emissions? Every big oil company has some kind of a target, but they're almost impossible to compare or to verify. So, you know, I think having some kind of consistency and be able to rank this and be able to say, look, some companies aren't doing well. And they flare too much, they leak too much, and they've got to do better. And you know, be able to point those out and say, you know, here's the guys who are doing well, here's the guys who are not doing well, and who need to improve.
Well, it seems like we've actually have gone over a bit of time right now, over 30 minutes. But just want to move to closing comments. Patrick, of course, we're heading to the end of the year. What is your outlook for 2023? Those low-hanging fruits that you see or that you're looking for to be implemented, of course, in this space of sustainability and energy transition?
I think, Brian, I'll come back to the points I was making. I mean, first of all, we need to continue our journey of decarbonizing our own industry. I mean, clearly there's a lot of work to be done. We clearly are ahead of the curve on that, but that doesn't mean to say we can't do better, and we're committed to doing better. But certainly the energy industry elsewhere is not doing what they need to do in this space. And that gives the whole industry, you know, a bad reputation. And there needs to be peer pressure put, and shareholder pressure put, and regulator pressure put on those companies to get into line and become best in class, because that's an easy low-hanging fruit. We can all do it. It's a question of commitment, determination to do that. And I think the second point, coming back to your point about transparency, is it's increasingly important to set targets, to set baselines of where you currently have, set plans, concrete plans that you are held accountable for delivering between your current baseline and where you have committed to being. And I think that is something, putting those plans in place that are transparent, that are measurable, that can be benchmarked, that is absolutely essential going forwards.
And Robin, we'll give you the last word with your closing comments. Low-hanging fruits that you are expecting to see in 2023 to, of course, help accelerate the energy transition in the region.
Well, look, it's a very challenging year. This year has been a challenging year for the energy industry. Next year will be as well. The Middle East is a core part of the world's response to the energy crisis, right? So the challenge there, I think, is to meet the world's energy needs in terms of supplying oil and gas and increasingly other forms of energy, including renewable electricity and hydrogen, and doing that in an environmentally responsible way, and helping to meet the shortages of energy that have been induced, you know, partly by some years of underinvestment, partly by some bad policy decisions, and partly by the Russian war in Ukraine. If the Middle East can do that, it can show that it's a constructive player in the world energy system. It'll be far easier for it to move ahead with its own decarbonization plans over the next 30 years.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Patrick Allman-Ward, CEO of Dana Gas, and Robin Mills, CEO of KMAR Energy. Really appreciate you sharing your insights today on today's podcast. And for those who are listening and watching, please feel free to follow both on social media for to see the amazing work that's being done, and of course their consistent insights in terms of pushing forward for sustainability and energy transition. And of course, follow Gulf Intelligence and Microsoft Online, where this podcast will be published. But thank you very much, both of you, for taking your time today. I appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
Pleasure, Brian. Thanks a lot.